Welcome to the Church of the Apostles. I'm one of the pastors here, and 8 years ago we conceptualized the idea of having a dinner and inviting people outside the church to come to the dinner. And so this event is for you, those of you that are outside the church, because we want you to have a chance to experience some of the great things that go on here at this church. And we don't want to always hoard that for ourselves, but we want it for people that are not a part of the church. So we're glad that you have come in as a guest, and we hope that you are comfortable here tonight. This gentleman grew up in Southern California in a religious family, but very early in his life, the dream to be a scientist emerged. And it basically took over his personality and drove his life for the next several decades. You're going to hear the story in detail. And at a certain point, he made contact with television companies, and his services were sought. And so he then began a 14-year career as the ABC News national correspondent, and he covered all kinds of extraordinary stories, and we want to show you a video of one of those stories. He was the first to visit the Titanic as a reporter in person. Turn your attention to the screen, please, and you'll see the stories that appeared on national television.
The Titanic has fascinated us ever since it struck an iceberg and sank nearly 90 years ago. And now, if you can cough up enough money, you can take a small submarine to the bottom of the ocean and see the wreck with your own eyes. That is extraordinary. An ABC News science editor, Michael Guillen, thought so, but there were moments when we thought he wouldn't be with us here tonight or maybe ever again. So here now is his first-person account of a haunting tour of the Titanic.
From day one, the Titanic has been, well, Titanic in every way. In 1912, she was the biggest, fastest, classiest luxury liner ever built. Now, the Titanic has become the most expensive, most incredible, most unlikely tourist attraction ever conceived.
It's not often you get the opportunity to do something extraordinary. This is one of those times.
That's right. For a whopping $35,000, climb aboard a small sub and go 2.5 miles down to the ocean bottom to see the most famous shipwreck in history. And the two mere submersibles, among only 5 such vehicles, able to withstand the huge water pressures down there, enough to crush you to death. When it's our turn to go down to the Titanic, Brian, my diving partner, and I elect to begin at the bow with a silent prayer. For the next 5 hours, it's like being in a time machine, traveling back to 1912. At the elegant first-class promenade, we can almost see and hear the people leaning out and waving goodbye. Then, as we approach the stern of the ship, we're suddenly caught up in a strong underwater current that pushes us towards one of the gigantic 21-ton propellers.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh, look at the size of that thing. Look at the blade, it's still clean, like it's brand new.
But when we try to back out...
Oh boy, I felt a little bit of a boom, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, look at these things.
Oh my God, look at the size of these things.
Oh my gosh, so are we stuck or what?
As this graphic shows, we appear to be somehow wedged beneath the wreck of the stern.
He's trying, I guess, to back out, but we're still feeling this real scraping sound. And as you can see, the whole view is clouded by this rusting metal.
Totally still. Underneath the stern of the Titanic.
After about 30 minutes, Victor's piloting skills and cool-headed attitude win the day.
We're out? Oh my God. Thank God.
Over the radio, we're ordered to the surface. Our visit at an end. During the 2.5-hour ascent, the ocean around us swirls with the images left behind.
Oh, the Titanic always fascinates us. Michael Guillen, I was worried about you when I saw this piece, but I knew you were going to be on tonight, so I knew you got out. Were you scared?
Yes, I was, but I also knew I was in good hands. I mean, they've made 100 dives and they haven't lost anybody yet, Barbara.
But is it too dangerous for people to go on?
I think that everybody has to decide that risk, but for me it was worth it. Why? Because the Titanic embodies the lesson of the 20th century. Our technology sometimes has unintended tragic consequences, and to be face to face with one of those great failures is a lesson in humility I'll never forget.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's welcome to our platform this evening, Dr. Michael Guillen.
Thank you, James. Wow, that still brings back some pretty scary memories. And I want to say Barbara just passed away some weeks ago, and she was the real deal.
Barbara Walters?
Yeah. I just have enormous respect for Barbara, and so I just pray rest in peace. But she was awesome to work with.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right, sir.
Yeah, give her absolutely.
All right, Michael, we're here to hear your story.
Yes.
So let's begin at the beginning. You grew up in a religious background. Tell us about it.
Well, I grew up in East Los Angeles in the middle of the Mexican barrio. I'm Mexican, Spanish-Cuban with a little Austrian thrown in for good measure. And I learned that later in life from my Aunt Alicia. But yes, my father was a journeyman carpenter, but he was also a minister. My two grandfathers were ministers, Pentecostal, Spanish-speaking. In fact, my paternal grandfather, after whom I'm named, Dr. Miguel Guillen, that's how I say my name in Spanish, was the president of the CLADIC, Concilio Latinoamericano de Iglesias Cristianas, which is a Latin American Council of Christian Churches. So to this day, he's legendary president, third grade education, but just a true man of God. But for me, we went to church every Sunday and many days during the week. But the services were held in Spanish, James, and so it kind of went over my head. The only thing I cared about was I got to play the drums in church. So that's all. It was not, even though it was a heavily religious house, it didn't affect me. I was just all about science from day one.
So early in your life, science, the aptitude for science emerged very powerfully.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about that.
I say since the second grade, I have clear-cut memories of wanting to be a scientist, but really, I can never remember a moment in my life when I didn't love science, which was inexplicable because, there weren't scientists walking the streets of East LA. I guarantee you that. Never met a scientist, never been inside a lab, none of my family, most of my family never went past high school. It was just a really odd thing for me to love science. But there I was. And so from my earliest memories I was just head over heels in love with science, and nothing else mattered to me, period.
And your father brought home a textbook, and that moved the ball down the field a bit.
I was in elementary school, and my dad already realized, and I guess just surrendered to the fact that he had this oddball of a kid, this terminal nerd who just loved science. It was totally foreign to him. But God bless him, we didn't have a lot of money, but I guess he was downtown LA one day, and there was a book sale, where you have a table with a bunch of used books. And Dad, God bless him, thought, well, my kid loves science, and he saw a book on nuclear force. It's called Nuclear Forces. And so he brought it home. He said, son, I have a book that's on science I thought you might like. Well, he didn't realize it was a graduate level text in nuclear physics, and neither did I, honestly. And so I just cracked open the book. It was paperback. And I saw words like Bose-Einstein statistics, spin, parity, and all these terms that meant nothing to me, but I was just determined to understand them. So I just worked my way through that book from beginning to end, and I pieced together, what nuclear physics was. I didn't realize I was teaching myself nuclear physics at that age, but I would read something in one page. I said, oh, that reminds me of something I read before, and I pieced it together. And so my dad inadvertently was responsible for teaching me nuclear physics. But it was fun. I really loved it. And I still have a copy of that book. That means a lot to me.
And as you move through elementary school, the teachers realized that you were a bit of a prodigy.
Yes.
That you had an intellect that had a curiosity. Talk about that curiosity.
Well, it was a good thing and a bad thing for me. It got me into trouble. My curiosity was totally unbridled. It still is. I think nothing is off the table in terms of questioning. I question everything all the time. I'm not afraid to ask any question. I demand honest answers. That's just been the MO of my life. And so early on, of course, that created a problem in the classroom because two things. Number one, I had already taught myself nuclear physics, trigonometry, logarithms, all these things. By the time I was being taught them in class, I had taught myself that years before. So I was totally bored and I became the class clown. I became very disruptive and I would get bad grades for my disruption. My poor parents would be hauled in to the principals and this kid, we don't know what to do with him. And I have such clear memories in my report card in elementary school where I got grades on everything, science, math, terrific. But there was one thing and it said inability to exert self-control. Inability to exert those words are burned in my mind because I was so ashamed of bringing that report card home to my parents. And so that was one problem. I was just bored in class. The other problem was I was just curious, just insatiable curiosity. And so I was just constantly interrupting the class with my questions to the point where a middle school teacher, math teacher, I'll never forget, got to calling me Michael Guillen instead of Michael Guillen. He called me Michael Guillen because I asked a Guillen questions. And I remember so clearly who he says, I would raise my hand and he would say, oh, there's Michael Guillen again. What is it? What do you want to know now? And I feel sorry for him. I mean, I realize I must have been a real pain in the neck, but it didn't stop me from asking questions. I just kept asking. I wanted to know.
All right, Dr. Guillen, talk about this lab that you built in the garage out back of your house.
Well, one day I was taking a chemistry class. I think this must have been in either middle school, early on. I loved my chemistry teacher, and he recognized that I was a prodigy, and so he took me kind of under his wing. He took me back to the supply, back in the back room where he had all the supplies, and I remember just falling in love with iodine. For some reason, iodine just made a real impression on me, and I remember he was explaining to me how I could make maybe a Polaroid filter using some mylar and saturated with iodine. Anyway, I had been given a little chemistry set with metal, the two doors and the metal cabinet one Christmas, but I felt I had outgrown that already. And so I went to Dad and I said, Dad, I want to build a real lab in the garage. Again, we didn't have a lot of money, but my dad was journeyman carpenter, and I'll never forget how he reacted to it. He said, well, son, he said, I need you to draw up what you have in mind. He says, I need you to draw up the plans. And so I did, and I was very diligent. I sent it to him. He made some corrections. He helped me. And then he took me to the hardware store, and I'll never forget him for that. That was pretty awesome because he didn't understand me. And I was just this odd kid. And now it affects me as a father when my kid comes up to me and says, Dad, I want to take boxing lessons. You know, Laurel and I are like, oh, God, of all things, boxing lessons. And, but I remember Dad, and I said, okay, son, if this is what you want to do. So even to this day, it affects me very, very deeply. My dad allowed me to build this chemistry lab, and then I proceeded to figure out how to make hydrogen out of things that my mom had in her kitchen. And I'll never tell anybody that because I don't want to repeat the recipe. It's actually quite simple, but it's an exothermic reaction, which means that when you bring the various ingredients together, they generate heat. It foams and fizzes. It's quite spectacular. And I would do it in big Coke bottles, and then I would take balloons and I would put the neck of the balloon over the Coke bottle, and then I would tie it, do several of those. And then I'd make little boxes out of cardboard like this, thick cardboard or thick paper, and I would get an insect, whether it's a spider, whatever I could land, cricket or whatever I could find, and a worm, a snail, a lot of snails in Southern California, and I would put it in the box, and then I would send them off to the balloons, and then I would chase the balloons until they came down, because eventually, obviously, the balloons are permeable, so the helium escapes from the balloons, and I would check to see if the insect had survived. So my parents had no clue that all of this was going on. Thank God, because I think they would probably have really put the kibosh on me. I think they would have locked me in my bedroom. I'm just guessing.
All right, so things progressed where you actually started writing a column in the local newspapers about science,
yes,
which was very interesting. And you even called a professor at Caltech about the
Feynman.
article,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he said, "No, I can't have time. You do it."
Yeah.
And that played out. You actually did it.
I did it. I was a gutsy kid. Richard Feynman, famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, I called him. I said, I think you should write a column because there are no columns in science. There's columns in coin collecting and all this. He said, great idea, kid, but you should do it. I'm too busy. And I took those words to heart. And later on, when I was at Cornell, I actually got to see Professor Feynman again, and I told him about it. What a life-changing thing that was for me. But I started writing up sample columns. I shopped it around. I was rejected by all the editors. But then one day I found one publisher, Southern California Publishing Company, and they published these penny newspapers, that come out every week for nothing. And he said, well, we can't pay you anything, kid, but we can put a little thumbnail picture of you on the thing. I thought, okay, great, fantastic. And it took off. I mean, people were writing into the editor. They loved it. It was all, the first one I called it To Mars or Bust. I called the science column Science Nonfiction because to me, real science is so much more interesting than science fiction. And that was really the beginning of my writing career. And eventually I earned $5 a column when it became very popular. So for me, that was a lot of money, $5 a week.
All right, so you escaped high school and went to UCLA. And
what's that? Yes.
You escaped and went.
Yes.
How were you received at UCLA as a freshman?
Well, to my shock, and I don't remember applying for it or anything, but maybe somebody else applied for me, or maybe I did. I just honestly don't remember, but I remember being a freshman at UCLA. I had just been accepted, and I got this letter that says, congratulations, you've just been named the UC, standing for University of California, UC President's Undergraduate Fellowship. And I thought, well, what is this all about? And not only did it come with a cash prize, but I got my own lab on the top floor of Knudsen Hall, the physics building, and I had this spectacular view of LA. And on top of that, somebody said, well, you're the first freshman ever to win this. Usually this goes to an upperclassman, a junior or a senior. So that was a really wonderful way, and I got to meet just did some wonderful stuff, something called the Nussbauer effect. I got to work hand in hand with a German physicist who complained to me, by the way. He said, here in America, we get no respect. He said, in Germany, they call me Herr Professor. Herr Professor. Here, it's just doctor this, doctor. And that was a wonderful experience at UCLA I never expected.
And you got a degree in?
I got a BS in math and physics, a bachelor's of science in math and physics, yes.
All right, so you left sunny Southern California.
Yes, I did.
For snowy northern New York.
Yeah.
You went to Cornell.
Cornell.
All right, let's talk about Cornell. Where was the lab that you were in at Cornell?
So when I got to Cornell, I instantly became what I call a scientific monk because I no longer had my parents around me. I no longer had friends around me. I flew from LA to Ithaca. I'll never forget that day at LAX. And I left all that behind. I was all by myself in Ithaca. So I could be the person I always was, which was a person devoted entirely to science. So I slept maybe 3 hours a day, and I worked 7 days a week in my basement lab. It was in the basement as opposed to the top floor. I think you said I went from the penthouse to the basement. It's just like opposite of remember the TV show The Jeffersons, moving on up? Well, I moved on down. But I loved it. It was a huge lab, and it was all to myself. It was I had no social life. I barely groomed myself. I barely ate. I begrudged the 3 hours of sleep I had to take, and that was my life. And I just loved it. I was on top of the world, just doing physics, experimental physics. Yeah.
And there you eventually got your PhD in 3 disciplines.
Yes, math, physics, and astronomy. And truthfully, the Cornell was ready to throw me out because I was just such a problem child. No grad student had ever had offices. Actually, I ended up having offices in 4 different places. I had one in the physics department, math department, the astronomy and space science department, and then in the electrical engineering department, because my thesis advisor, who was different from my thesis chairman, was an EE. He was an electrical engineer. They had never had I dare say they've never had anybody like me. Since then, I was just a problem, and the faculty would convene and say, what is going on with this kid? What's going on? And fortunately, they recognized my aptitude in this kind of stuff, and so they cut me some slack, and so I ended up, a PhD with physics, math, and astronomy. Okay. And I had members of all 3 departments in my committee, and in my final PhD exam, they all could grill me on anything.
And during this period in which you're getting deeper and deeper into science, God's not in the picture.
No, of course not. No,
God's not in the picture.
I had no hostility to God or anything like that. I just didn't think of it. It didn't matter to me. None of that mattered to me. As I said, I didn't even have a social life. Why would I be thinking about God if I wasn't even thinking about having a girlfriend? Yeah. So, I mean, you have to understand that I was living in this wonderful paradise, this bubble, and it's called science. And every waking moment for me was all about thinking about the universe, studying as much as I could, trying to understand, asking a jillion questions about the universe. I started in elementary particle physics. I became very interested in galaxies. So I went from the very small to the very large and everything in between. And it's not changed. I still love science.
All right, so it was kind of like, it was paradise for you.
Yes.
But kind of soon there was trouble in paradise, and that you started to see things in the science process that began to trouble you. Speak about that,
Because
please.
I went into Cornell with the intention of going into experimental elementary physics. You have to understand, in physics, there is this huge divide between experimental and theory. It's true, actually, of most sciences. But especially in the physical sciences. And so I petitioned about a year and a half in. I just had a change of heart. I won't get into the whole story. But I petitioned to go from experimental to theoretical. That was a big deal. That's not easily done, and I needed to get the approval of Hans Bethe, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who was a faculty member at Cornell. He was on the top floor of LNS. So I was here in the basement. He was up there on the 8th floor. And he's the man who got the Nobel Prize for figuring out how the sun shines. And he set certain challenges to me. I passed the challenges, so I was able to go to theory. So suddenly I was able to spend all this time not just tinkering in my lab, making things and doing things experimentally, but I literally had permission now to just think. Just think about the universe. Do my math. And just think and figure out solutions to problems that were facing us as physicists. And that was the point where I began interrogating myself and interrogating science about asking deep questions, and I was not getting answers that satisfied me, and especially ones in cosmology. I was particularly interested in the origins of the universe, asking a very simple but profound question: how did the universe come to be? And by then, of course, I had an intimate relationship with the universe. I knew it like the back of my hand. It was my best friend. And so when I found that I wasn't getting the answers that satisfied my curiosity, and we have the standard cosmological model, I was very familiar with it, and so forth, general relativity and all this sort of thing. And so I thought, well, if I can't get answers to my deep questions from my beloved science, where am I going to look? I mean, this has been my entire world. Mm-hmm. And that's when I remember one of my professors, Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer. He was just getting to be famous at that point. He was getting the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and he was doing Cosmos, and I was on the front lines of all that. And I remember Carl always talking about the Vedas. He was always quoting the Vedas. He was Jewish. But he was a secular Jew, and he had an interest. As I'm this young man trying to find an answer, asking these jillion questions, but this one in particular: how did this universe come to be? I knew about dark matter by then and all this sort of thing. I'm not going to get into all that, but it was a profound question for me to ask, and it was important for me to understand an answer to that. So I thought, well, Carl is talking about the Vedas. I have no idea what the Vedas are, but they're important to him, and I admire him and respect him. So I went to Olin Library, and I looked up the Vedas, and sure enough, it was the sacred literature of the Hindu religion, which is generally considered to be the oldest religion, belief system in the world. So as I do everything, I dove in with both hands and both feet. I never do anything halfway. Whatever I commit to, whatever I'm curious about, I'm wired to just exhaust it. I just need to know everything about it. Not some things about it, everything about it. So I basically became a Hindu, and I found it quite actually interesting. I think the Hindu religion is quite fascinating. And then I remember getting a copy of the I Ching from a friend of mine who I guess realized that I was on this weird journey. I was immersed in Hermann Hesse. I was reading all his novels. I was identifying with his protagonists, these tormented intellectuals in search of the meaning of life. And I said, that's me at this point. And so I got the copy of the I Ching. I started reading it. It's pretty interesting. So I immersed myself in Buddhism and Confucianism, Taoism. And then one thing led to another. Transcendental meditation at that time was very popular. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was making the rounds of universities at that time. I attended his seminars. I loved it because they said if you became a devotee of TMI, Transcendental Meditation, you could levitate. I thought, hey, I could defy gravity. You know, that appealed to the scientist in me. You know, and I thought, ooh, I want to check that out. Plus, I was an amateur magician, so I'm thinking, you know, this is probably just a trick. But I want to find out for myself if this is the real deal. And I saw pictures of people levitating. I'm thinking, I got to get to the bottom of that, again, with just curiosity. And then my thesis advisor, Richard Lieboff, may he rest in peace, was Jewish, so he started taking me to Shabbat services on Friday. Then we had a little Oneg Shabbat afterwards at his house. And then Islam, and just on and on and on, and Baha'i. And I was just interested. At this point, I was now, okay, if science can't answer some basic questions that I'm asking, then who can? What can? So gloves were off. And as I said, everything's on the table with me. I question everything. And so that was an interesting period in my life. But I was still, science for me was still, you know,
And you kind of started running into some realities such as truth is bigger than proof.
Well, that came later. That came later. Yes, because I was in math and I was very heavily involved, and I was even teaching classes in the math department. I came to know Kurt Gödel as by far the most brilliant logician who ever lived. And in 1933, he came out with two profound theorems that changed math forever. It's called Gödel's incompleteness theorems. That's not on his list of things, and there will be a quiz, by the way. That will be on the final exam. But it fascinated me because, in a word, and I'm just reducing something beautiful and complex down to one phrase. I thought to myself, how can I explain Gödel's incompleteness theorems to somebody who doesn't know about math, doesn't care about math? But I came up with saying the gist of Gödel's incompleteness theorems was truth is bigger than proof. What does that mean? That any system more complex than geometry, so any system, let's say from arithmetic on up, that's axiomatic, there will always be truths that cannot be proved logically. It's profound. And the most ironic thing is that he used logic to prove the limits of logic. It's brilliant. And so that started me thinking, like, okay, wow, all right, truth is bigger than proof. So be careful, Guillen. Don't go around asking people to prove this and that, because it may be a truth that cannot be proved, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it is a truth. That's profound if you think about that. If you stop and think about that, that's a game changer. And this is all playing into my mind as I was searching for what I could believe in. I was searching for answers that could answer my, I was looking for things that could answer my basic questions. And all of this was just kind of going into the stew. It was swirling around in there. I wasn't coming to any conclusions or anything like that, but I just found the journey fascinating.
And believing, seeing is believing,
yes,
kind of began to reverse itself a little bit.
Well, I had always lived by seeing is believing. Of course. I mean, it's like, that's the skeptic's mantra. And I was a scientist through and through. And so I was of the mind that unless I can see it, I won't believe it. Ghosts or angels or anything like that. It's like, no, fantasy land. And so one of the jarring things was when I was in grad school and I started learning about dark matter, and this was a profound discovery that was made in the 30s by an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky. He was a Swiss-American astronomer working out of Caltech at Mount Wilson in Pasadena. Pasadena, Michelle. Michelle is from Pasadena, one of my wonderful guests tonight. And without getting too crazy, we look at galaxies and we look at clusters of galaxies, and we notice that they're spinning like carousels. And there is something called the virial theorem that relates the rate of spin to the mass of the object. So the more massive the object, the faster it spins. Okay, that's the virial theorem in a nutshell. And so Zwicky was looking at images of spiral galaxies and galaxy clusters, and he said, these things are spinning a whole lot faster than they should be. What's causing that? At first he thought it was an error. He kept looking, no, it's not an error. This is a real thing. This is not an artifact of some mistake. And so he said there has to be something within that cluster of galaxies that's driving this extra spin, and he came up with the name Dunkelmaterie, which is German for dark matter. And so I was learning this in grad school. We didn't call it dark matter by then. At that time, they were calling it the missing mass problem. And it was, for us as budding scientists, we had to figure out, okay, how do we solve this missing mass problem? What is this stuff exactly within the galaxy that our telescopes can't see? Is it a form of matter, or is it something completely different? And honestly, we still don't know. After all these years, we still don't know, but we still call it something. Anyway, we're good at naming things we don't understand in science. That's a little dirty little secret, okay? So think about that, James. Here I'm learning that, and later on very quickly we learned that about 27% of the universe, or our part of the universe, is made of dark matter. So what I was learning is that 27% of our universe, I can't see it. So how can I keep possibly living by the motto, seeing is believing? Think about it. It just doesn't make any sense, because otherwise I have to concede that I have to believe in at least 27% of the universe that I can't see. So that I knew I had to ditch that motto. I just didn't know what to replace it with. So that was the turmoil, that was the uncertainty that was driving my journey.
All right, okay, good. And then you go home about 3 a.m. from the lab, and there's a foreign object slid under your door.
Yeah, it was
Talk
like
to us about
a night
that.
like any other night. I was going between my lab. It was 3 a.m. I loved going across campus at night. Everybody else was asleep. I was the only one awake. And I go into my tiny little dorm room, which was a converted janitor's closet, and I loved it because it was right near the bathroom. And so I opened the door, and the thing I remember the most is the noise. I heard a scraping sound, and I looked down, and there's a white envelope. I'm thinking, I bend over, I open the envelope, it's a Valentine's Day card. I'm like, my first thought was, I didn't even know it was Valentine's Day. I didn't care it was Valentine's Day, and technically it was no longer Valentine's Day because it was 3 a.m. the following day. And it was signed by Laurel Lucas. And I'm like, okay, she was in my physics for poet class a couple of years before, an undergraduate. And I didn't really think much about it. I set it aside. I had no idea why in the world would she be sending me a Valentine's Day card. So I just went to sleep for 3 hours. I went back to my lab. And it was business as usual. But, I kept thinking, well, why is she sending me a Valentine's Day card? That's how stupid I was. And so finally I tracked her down. I saw her on campus. I can't remember if I tracked her down or she tracked me down or we encountered each other by accident. Anyway, it was just an opportunity for me to say, hey, I got that card, thank you. And that was it. I didn't care. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't care to understand what was happening. I just wanted to stay with my studies. But that led to her and I getting to know each other. And I remember having late nights and midnight up on the roof of the house she was sharing with a bunch of other co-eds there in College Town. And one of the things I noticed about Laurel is she was very smart. She was Kappa Kappa Gamma, so she was a beautiful sorority girl. And I'm thinking, why is she hanging around with a terminal nerd like me? It's like Beauty and the Beast. And I mean, literally, Beauty and the Beast. If you saw well, you did see pictures of me when I was younger. It's not a pretty sight. But we had these most wonderful conversations, and I found her to be interested in what I was doing. She was interested in my physics and my math and my astronomy, and she was interested in my Hermann Hesse-like journey. And she confessed to me that, she was also kind of looking, seeking, trying to figure stuff out. And so I remember one day going back and forth, she said, hey, you've done Hinduism, Buddhism, all these things. Have you ever read the Bible? And my reaction was immediate, like, no, for several reasons. Number one, I grew up hearing about the Bible, and so I don't think there's anything new there. It's just no. And number two, I said, my impression is that people who read the Bible, believe in the Bible, are truly hostile to science, which, in case you haven't noticed, is my number one love in life. And so why would I really want to do that? But she then said something that changed my life. And she said, well, I haven't read the Bible either. So if you read it, I'll read it with you. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not really interested in the Bible, but I'm interested in knowing more about this girl who's really smart and beautiful. And it was the first girlfriend I ever had in my life. And so it was kind of a new journey for me. I was interested. And so we did. It took us 2 years to read the whole thing. And little did I know it was a game changer, but it was the New Testament. And I'll never forget, it was really strange when we started reading the New Testament. This character, Jesus, appears out of nowhere. And the description of him but the thing that really impressed me or got my attention, let's put it like this, was how Jesus spoke. And I suddenly realized this guy is talking translogical language. It's very similar to my quantum mechanics that I've been learning. And this was the first time I'd ever encountered anything like that on any religion whatsoever. This is the first time that any kind of sacred figure was speaking this way, was behaving this way. And so that was enough to get my attention and keep my attention through the end of the New Testament. And when we were finished, it's not like I fell on my knees and I'm not that kind of guy. But it was enough to say, this is something I need to follow up on. I need to figure this out. And so it took me many, many years to do that, yeah.
All right, I'd like to bring Laurel into the conversation to get...
Here she is, my beautiful wife.
Hello.
Hi there. Laura, we have two questions for you. First of all,
Okay.
what prompted the Valentine card under the door?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Well, I was listening to his description, and I'm like, okay, he must have been blinded by love or something, because this is what I remember. I had to take physics for poets to graduate, and I was fortunate enough to take his class. He was the TA. He was already a legend. I think he ended up winning the teaching award twice at Cornell and once at Harvard, or something. Twice at Harvard, once at Cornell. And so about a year later, I'm walking in front of the campus store, and I see him scurrying past, and I said, Michael, yeah, remember me? I took your class last year, whatever. He said, oh, it's nice to see you again. Guess what? I'm starting this new organization called the Leonardo da Vinci Society to bring together specialists from all over the campus to talk together on very important subjects. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting. I'd love to help out. So my Debbie and a couple of friends of mine and ours, we would come. He would say, okay, we're going to lay out posters, or we're going to do a publication, and we would come in the middle of the night after we were done with our studies, and we'd help him. And it was funny because I remember, I think it was Debbie and I, or several of us were talking one day, and we're like, this guy is like a legend on campus. I mean, there are some stories that, he can't be found, at any time of the day or night sleeping in his room. And so the rumor was going around that he had a secret hideout in the stacks of Olin Library that nobody knew about. They said, oh, and this is a grad student who's taken more graduate courses than any other student in the history of Cornell. That was the other rumor. And then there was like, when he disappears in the summer, because he goes and writes for magazines in the summertime. It's like, grad students don't do that. You can't, do that if you're a scientific grad student. So there are all kinds of legends. He was a legend. And I remember talking with my girlfriends at one point, and we're like, he's really scruffy and he's, kind of strange. I wonder what kind of woman he'll end up with. And so anyway, I kind of felt sorry for him when Valentine's Day came around, and I figured, well, I kind of feel sorry for him, but he's intriguing, and I think this is going to have an interesting effect. So I put the Valentine's Day card under there, and then after that, he started paying a little more attention to me. He's like, oh yeah, you're one of the, you were in my class, yeah, and you're helping out with Da Vinci, yeah. So that's where it went from there.
And the second question is, what prompted let's read the Bible through together? What prompted you to propose that to?
I'd been reared Catholic, had my confirmation, and then my parents' marriage just exploded, and that was the end of going to church, and that was kind of, I wasn't really that dedicated to it anyway. And my mother immediately just got immersed in New Age. So by the time I came, and I kind of followed her, I was like, oh, this is cool. So by the time I came to Cornell, I could meditate, TM. I could, I knew astrology really well, numerology, just about any kind of, new agey thing that was out there. I used to practice seeing auras around people and things like that. But I felt like, Christianity, the Christians I'd met on campus or the Christians, I just like, I don't get these people. They must be needy or something. They're very needy people, I think. And then I was also, I was always interested. I was a natural resources major, but I was a communications minor because I really wanted to be, I wanted to be a journalist. So I had this kind of journalism mind. I'm like, and you see these preachers on TV and everything, they're always quoting the Bible. But what's the context? Are they giving me the truth because they're saying, this applies to you, and this is, they'll quote the Bible, and this is why, this is where you should behave, or this is where you should be. I'm like, I'm not going to believe those people. I don't know the context. So at some point I felt like, well, one of these days I'm going to have to read the Bible. And then when I was talking to him, having conversations with him at night up on the roof, it was just like mind-blowing because, he would say things about the universe, and I'd be like, and so it was the kind of thing where I felt, this would be a great guy to read the Bible with because he has this mind, that's so impressive, but he's also very spiritually oriented. But I felt like, between the two of us, we would get to the bottom of this Bible thing. So
very good.
Why I
Thank you. Give Laura a hand. Yeah. Thank you very much.
You can see why I married her. Yeah.
All right. Get your note sheet ready, gang. All right. As you progressed 2 years reading the Bible and thinking these things through, and thank you very much, Laurel, that was very helpful, you began to do comparisons between atheism, faith, Christianity, so forth. And you came up over time with a way of thinking of this.
Yes.
And we have a slide here we're going to put up, and we want you to explain this to us.
Okay. Well, when I was in the midst of my Hermann Hesse-like journey, and I was learning about all these religions, naturally I wanted to compare them. And being a scientist, what better way to do it than to create a matrix? And I wanted to interrogate every belief system, and I've only got 3 of them here because we only have a limited amount of time. But I did this for all the other religions that I immersed myself in, and I wanted, it's like when you go shopping online, like on Amazon or something like that, and you're thinking about, well, I want to get this maybe lawnmower, and then they allow you to compare, the different lawnmowers. That's what I was really doing here. It was very, very straightforward. And I was shocked by what I discovered. And so this slide here, let's just go through this very, very briefly. I'm going to just show you, and this is you have to understand this is a tiny part of the actual matrix, which is much larger. It's like, 10 by 20 or something like that. So this is a 3 by 3. And questions that I wanted to ask is, does absolute truth exist? Pretty straightforward question. Does it? It either does or it doesn't. Are there truths that cannot be proven? And is the universe designed for life? 3 very straightforward questions. I didn't have a prejudice as to the answer, but I wanted to find out each of these worldviews, what do they have to say about the answers? So here I go. I advance this like this. So the first one is scientific. Does absolute truth exist? Yes, of course, because otherwise there would be no science. And a lot of people make this mistake. And again, I know our time is limited, so I got to keep this going. So forgive me if I zip through this and I leave you wondering. A lot of this is in my book and so forth and so on. But let's go back to that, Rich, and that is even the theory of relativity. Let's take special theory of relativity. Everybody says, well, even science says truth is relative. Well, it's true and not true. Because you have to understand that even the things that are relative, which is anything having to do with energy, mass, space, and time, those are relative truths. Those are not absolute truths. But their relativeness is determined by an absolute equation, the equations of relativity. You understand? So, but people say, they abuse the theory of relativity to excuse their belief in that all truth is relative. It's just not true. All right, so then what about the question, are there truths that cannot be proven? Yes, I've just explained to you, Gödel's theorem. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Is the universe designed for life? This is one of the most astonishing things we have discovered in the 20th century. In the late 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st century, there's a fantastic book by Sir Martin Rees, who's an atheist. He's the Astronomer Royal in Great Britain. Brilliant man. He wrote a book called Just Six Numbers. And it talks about what I describe as the vital signs of the universe. Again, I have to zip through this, so forgive me. But you know, when you go to the doctor and checks your vital signs to see how you're doing, well, we do that to the universe. The universe has vital signs. And we call them natural constants, but think of them as vital signs. And we now are very good at determining the numerical value of these constants, these vital signs. And guess what? They all have precisely the value needed for life to exist in the universe. Precisely. A little bit too much, a little bit too little, there wouldn't be life. Not just on Earth, but the entire universe. Okay, so the answer is yes. Let's look at the atheist worldview, which was my worldview at the time, clearly. Does absolute truth exist? No. We felt that, all truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth. The answer to the question, are there truths that cannot be proven? The answer is no. Bertrand Russell, for example, was famous atheist, brilliant mathematician, said, if I can't prove it, I can't believe it. It's not true. If I can't prove it, I can't true. So he's using logic as kind of the gold standard for determining whether something is true or not. And then, is the universe designed for life? Absolutely not. The standard kind of atheist point of view is that, in physics, at least in the standard standard cosmological model, is we believe the vacuum, the quantum vacuum, which is everything and nothing. I can't get into it. It's a very translogical concept. Created the universe. So it's not designed for life. So the Christian worldview, which was the one I was kind of exploring when I met with Laurel, does absolute truth exist? Of course. One of those being that this God described in the Bible exists. Are there truths that cannot be proven? Yes. I can't prove to you that God exists. It's one of those kind of Gödelian truths. That you just can't prove. So when somebody says to you, believe in God, prove it, they don't know what they're asking. It's a silly question. It's a meaningless question. And then finally, is the universe designed for life? Of course, yes. The biblical point of view, Genesis is spelled out in Genesis, is, yeah, of course, it was intentional. It wasn't an accident. So when I looked at that matrix, Rich, let's stay on it for a moment. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? You have to understand, I was fully invested in that middle column. I was living by an atheist point of worldview. When I looked at this, I couldn't believe my eyes because I saw, wait a minute, how can I be a scientist and an atheist? Something doesn't compute. They're completely at odds with one another. And yet, look at Christianity, and so the Christian worldview is much more in step with the scientific worldview. That I had to ponder for a long time. But even that didn't convince me, that, okay, this is the one I got to go with. But it was certainly evidence that I needed to take very, very seriously. And as I explored other questions, as I said, we're not getting into is like, are humans unique? Is the nature of light unique? Many other questions I asked myself, and I compared all the worldviews and their answers. And it kept coming up that this Christian worldview was very much consistent with the science, and that really shocked me and kind of shook me to my very foundations, yeah.
And then from there, the idea of IQ, SQ took shape in your mind. Can you talk about that,
Yeah,
please?
because when I was at Harvard, in the 1980s, Howard Gardner, who's a psychologist at Harvard, came out with his theory of multiple intelligences. His theory was that there was more to intelligence than just IQ, and I actually agree with that. So he lists like 8 or 9 other intelligences, like athletic intelligence, emotional intelligence, literate intelligence, and so forth. And I thought, he's on to something. Kinesthetic intelligence, and so forth. I said, he's on to something. But what shocked me at that time, and I was deep enough into this Hermann Hesse-like journey that I said, why doesn't he have an intelligence there that acknowledges the human spirit? And so, and I had learned a lot about the human spirit from many different belief systems. And I was beginning to be very intrigued by it. I had a lot of questions. I had a jillion questions about this notion of a human spirit. Is it a real thing? Is it just a fantasy? Is it whatever? But I knew I had to take it at least serious enough to think it through. And so I thought, why hasn't Gardner got some kind? And then it hit me. What hit me was that all the list of Gardner's multiple intelligence, every other animal has it. Whales, cetaceans have IQ. Other animals have athletic intelligence and all the rest of it. Even parrots, African gray parrots, can vocalize. They have pretty decent vocabulary. So they have that kind of vocal intelligence. And so, but the one thing that no other animal on the planet has, I realized, and this just came to me in thinking about this, was spiritual. What I ended up calling, I coined the term spiritual intelligence, or SQ. And as I developed that and as I thought about it, I even ended up writing a book about it, Can a Smart Person Believe in God? That came out in the early 2000s. And for me, that concept is key to making sense out of the universe, our place in it, of who we are, what we are. It's a very fertile concept, and it's become, people understand it when I explain it to them.
Well, let's go to the next slide, and let's have you explain this one.
And again, very, very briefly, here's again with a matrix. Naturally, if you invoke IQ and SQ, and I'm not including all of Gardner's other intelligences, okay? But just these 2x2 matrix, very simple. I'm saying, all right, to understand the different kinds of worldviews that are out there, let me understand, let's say, the first one, which would be a high IQ, low SQ point of view, or a worldview. This is a worldview that I was quite familiar with growing up. That's the category, my worldview would fall into that broad category. And again, I'm simplifying a more complicated notion that I have developed in the books that I've published and so forth. But I call this an intellectual cyclops. Why? Because I likened the use of IQ and SQ to the two lenses of a 3D glasses. You know how you have green and red? Or if you use polarized, they're opposite polarization. And so if you look at the universe with just one eye, let's say with IQ alone, then what do you see? You just see a flat universe. It's interesting, but not as interesting as it could be. And so this is what I call an intellectual cyclops. And then let's go to the next one, which would be the antithesis of that, the antipodal worldview would be a spiritual cyclops. This is somebody who just believes that kind of minimizes the importance of the mind, not particularly intellectual. They believe in blind faith. They actually prize what they call blind faith, which I think is a big mistake, and it's not even biblical. People will cite the story of Doubting Thomas. That's not giving you permission to be a spiritual cyclops, and I can explain that at length if I had more time. And then the other quadrant of this 2x2 is somebody who's low IQ, low SQ. This is somebody who has just enough IQ and SQ to be dangerous. And by the way, I wrote this 20 years ago. But really what I would do, I wouldn't say high and low, I would say misguided and enlightened. So if you will, in my more recent books, you'll see that I refer to this as enlightened IQ, misguided IQ, misguided SQ, and enlightened SQ. And I explain what I mean by misguided and enlightened. So this quadrant would be somebody who has a very unenlightened IQ and a very misguided IQ and a misguided SQ. So somebody might say they know a little bit about crystals and they know enough about this non-physical or metaphysical world. They start thinking, okay, well, these crystals have healing power. Very superstitious, same with astrology. They know just enough about the stars and the orbits of the stars and so forth, and they have an awareness of an unseen world, of a metaphysical world. So here, boom, you have astrology. So this is what that would fit that quadrant there. And then, of course, the ideal person, somebody who I envision has what I call stereoscopic faith, which is to say they have both enlightened IQ, they understand the universe, they understand the evidence that we've accumulated, scientific evidence, but they also have an enlightened They have an enlightened kind of spiritual quotient. They have an enlightened spiritual understanding of the universe as well. And so this is what I think we all should strive to be. So again, this is folks, I'm just simplifying things that have taken me decades. So please understand that if it comes across to you as a little bit simplistic, it's because I'm reduced to doing this. James is going to give me the hook if I talk too long. He's already warned me many times I have to keep it brief. But a book that will be, I explain all of this in my books. If you're at all interested and you want to take a deeper dive, it's all there.
And so the ideal person has the combined perspective.
Yes,
of the
it's what I
IQ
call
in this.
stereoscopic faith. It's the person that I strive to be, which is to honor both my IQ and honor my SQ. That is to say, and by enlightenment, I mean whatever I believe is supported by the best evidence that we have, whether it's believing in dark matter, believing in dark energy, believing in the quantum vacuum, believing in black holes, or it's believing in God, it's believing in angels, it's believing in demons, whatever it is. I strive to be a person who has a worldview that is solidly grounded on the best available evidence that we have. Okay. Yeah.
Right,
that in a nutshell. Again, I'm simplifying, but that's...
Okay, let's go to the experience with the Titanic.
The what?
Titanic.
Yes, okay.
And let's talk about how in those frightening moments,
yes,
God met you.
Well, as you could see in the tank, in the submarine, it was chaos when we collided with the propeller. See, when the Titanic sank, it broke into two pieces. And then the stern did a somersault, and it landed on its back. And so when you go down there and you start at the bow, there's a debris field in the middle. This is where you see all the suitcases, ladies' shoes, and medicine cabinets, cases of champagne. So when we got stuck down there, there was chaos. And my diving buddy, Brian Cook, is a British comedy writer, but he wasn't laughing. And Victor, I found out, was a former MiG pilot and very solid. But during this chaos, I could hear the communications through the hydrophones, very watery sound, very creepy, very scary. And Brian kept saying, he was concerned, and so was I, honestly. But I kind of got into my scientific mode. I'm a problem solver. I'm a professional problem solver. And so I kept thinking to myself, there's got to be a way out of this. This is a problem that has a solution. And I soon realized that it isn't. There is no solution to this. And I'm 2.5 miles down below the surface. There's just no way. You can't call AAA to come tow you out. There's just no. So I was faced with the words in my mind came very clear. I'll never forget. This is how it's going to end for you. Those were the words that came into my mind. And then I thought of Laurel. And I thought, wow, I've been all over the world. I've been to the North Pole, the South Pole. I've done all these things, and this is how it's going to end for you. And then something quite strange happened, and because I'm a reporter and I'm a scientist, I'm simply going to tell you, you make out of it what you want. I'm simply going to try to report it to you as faithfully as I can. Something happened that changed the atmosphere within that sub. It went from kind of chaos to... there was a peace that kind of just settled into the whole sub. Not just with me, but it just kind of inhabited the entire sub, and it was quick. It was almost what we call in science a discontinuity. Didn't ramp up to that. It was just here, and then it was here. And then I felt a tremendous peace, and I just surrendered to the moment, and I was ready to give up my life. Then, fortunately, Victor got us out, and I don't know how he did it, but... and then it took us 2.5 hours to get back up. So I had a lot of time to think about what had just happened. And it wasn't until much later, Laurel and I were reading the Bible, and there's this psalm, I think it's like Psalm 139, and it speaks about wherever I go, I'll be there. And there's a passage that particularly struck me, because it says, even if you're at the depths of the sea.
May I read the verse?
Yeah.
It reads like this, Psalm 139, 9 and 10. It says, if I take up the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will take hold of me.
Yeah. And that pretty much describes as best I can what happened to me down there. Mm. And so I was still I was still exploring Christianity. This was, for me, I think, I don't want to say it's a test, but it ended up being that. It was like, okay, how do you explain this, Guillen? And it wasn't until, I think that was like in 98, I went down there. It wasn't until like 2002 or something like that, Laurel, where I really just dropped the other shoe and I said, you know what, the journey has brought me here. You just have to accept it. This is where the evidence has led you. Be honest about it. Be intellectually honest about it. It's the Christian worldview that really makes the most sense given everything. And I'm very careful not to disparage any other religion because to be honest with you, there's a place in my heart for every one of those religions. I learned something valuable and precious. And I will never speak ill of any other belief system. But that's a journey for me that was precious. I enjoyed every minute of it. I enjoyed the people I met along the way. But for me, being the person I am, asking a jillion questions, searching for truth, trying to figure out what I can hang my hat on, what is the worldview that I can truly believe in with all my everything, gut, heart, mind, everything I've learned as a scientist about the universe, our place in it, who we are, what we're not. It was inescapable. It was really quite a no-brainer at the end of it all.
Art, on the ABC News Times Square, you serving on a panel.
Yes.
And you were talking about the cloning of sheep in England.
Yeah.
And you were asked to make a concluding comment. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, Ian Wilmot, I remember on a Sunday, Laurel got the call. It was a Sunday morning from ABC headquarters in New York, and the producer was asking, well, there's something coming over the wires that some guy in Scotland, Ian Wilmot, had just cloned a sheep. He's calling it Dolly. And we're just wondering, is this a story that Michael needs to cover? And of course, Laurel knew enough. She said, he's not here, but yeah, this is a major story. You're gonna need to have him covered. So we sprang into action, and for the months that followed, I mean, it changed textbooks because all the biology textbooks up until then had said, look, we had cloned tomato plants, we had cloned salamanders, but the consensus, the scientific consensus of that time, and all the textbooks expressed this, was that you can never clone a mammal. So when Ian Wilmot cloned a mammal, it was a nuclear bomb in biology. And so, of course, I covered it, and I got very complicated, the story. I followed it for months. I led the story. I was scooping my competition at NBC, CBS, CNN, the whole bunch of them. I was leaving them in my dust, and because scientists trusted me. And so when it came to say, I did the first interview with Ian Wilmot, and because he trusted me as a scientist, I had credibility. The other reporters didn't. They hardly knew any science, but they call themselves science reporters. It's a scandal. It's true still even today. It's ridiculous. The media is so scientifically illiterate, it's pathetic. So don't believe most of what they say. Do your own homework. But there reached a point where there emerged this question, this ethical question, because there was a lot of speculation, and even the National Academy of Sciences had held a seminar in Washington, D.C. Is it going to be possible to clone a human being? And if we can, should we? So Good Morning America asked me to be part of a panel discussion. Charlie Gibson was moderating. There was other people on the panel. And I can't go into the whole story. I think I tell it in the book, but it was one of those, just ridiculous. I was showering to get ready to go to do the show, and then something happened to me. I can't get into it. We don't have the time. But it was very unnerving to me. It was something that was weird. And in the end, I found myself in the studio at this round table. I saw the countdown clock. And when you're in national TV, you know there are soft outs and hard outs. This was going to be a hard out. That means the computer takes you out to a commercial, whether you like it or not, whether you're in the middle of a sentence or not. It was a hard out. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see the countdown. It was 10, 9, and so forth. And wouldn't you know, Charlie comes to me at the end and he says, Michael, what do you think about all this? What's your position on this? And because of what had happened to me that morning in the shower, I I blurted out, well, Charlie, I'm concerned about it not only as a scientist, but as a scientist who happens to believe in God. And as soon as I said that, I thought to myself, I have just sabotaged my entire career. It was the first time I had spoken out loud my belief in God, and I was petrified. And I remember just getting up. It went to commercial. I mean, and it was like 2, 3, 2, 1, and I just managed to get that phrase in, and then boom, it went right to commercial. Charlie didn't even have a chance to react to it. And I remember just getting up in a daze and thinking, just really frightened. I thought, oh, why did I do that? Why did I say that? And next thing I remember, I'm walking out through and all the cameramen and the gaffers and the prop people, the floor director started coming to me and we didn't know, we just assumed you were an atheist, you're a scientist. We didn't know you believed in God. Awesome, man. And they all wanted to shake my hands and I'm like, oh, okay. And then I called, as soon as I got back to the green room, I called my producer, Melissa Dunst, God bless her, one of the best producers I ever worked with. And she's Jewish. I said, Melissa, did you watch the show? She says, I'm watching. I was watching. And I said, oh my God. I said, well, just tell me what's going on. She says, well, I'm already hearing from the ABC operators. They're getting flooded with calls. And I thought, oh, okay, this is it. The president, Dave Weston's going to call me up to his office. I really feared. I thought I just shot myself in the foot. And then something happened. By the time I got back to my office, Melissa said, no, just the opposite. I mean, they're like 98% favorable. And you're even getting marriage proposals. I swear, that's what she said. She said, so I was like, okay, all right. But I was still, I didn't feel comfortable doing it. But then it was shortly after that I wrote the book, Can a Smart Person Believe in God? Because I felt, you know what, I have to be honest about this. I'm an intellectual. I have to share with others what I've learned, whether they like it or not, whether it matters to them or not. It doesn't matter. I just need to document what's happened to me. And so, yeah.
Okay. Couple of things I want to cover.
Yes.
As we come to a conclusion.
Yes.
As you were curious about the world, you were also curious about the Scripture and the Bible and what it taught.
Yes.
And you knew that the central figure in the Bible, and of course in Christianity, is Jesus himself.
Right.
And you threw yourself into examining from a scientific perspective the claims of the Bible about Jesus.
Right.
And I'm going to read a few of these, and you just comment on them briefly from a science standpoint.
Oh, okay.
First of all, was Jesus an historically authentic figure?
Yes, that's indisputable. Even Richard Dawkins, who is probably the most outspoken and famous atheist alive today, he's out of Oxford and a biologist, wrote the book Selfish Gene. Brilliant man, but devout atheist. He has even publicly, he's on record as saying, yeah, Jesus existed. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
Okay. Virgin birth of Jesus.
Very interesting for me. The whole concept of virgin birth was interesting. And again, I know we have to keep it brief, but the thing that immediately came into my mind was there's a phenomenon in nature called parthenogenesis, and it's virgin birth. And we know there are certain animals in nature that give birth. It's what we call asexual reproduction. And so that concept was familiar to me, and I know other belief systems like Egyptians, Osiris and Isis said to be the result of a virgin birth, but it's nothing like it. And people, again, there's just a lot of misinformation, guys. You just have to do your homework. It's just so much misinformation. But so yeah, that was fine with me. It didn't.
And no human virgin birth has ever been
although
recorded.
Japanese have created a monkey using parthenogenesis. That was about as far as it goes. Yeah,
but no human virgin birth recorded in science.
No.
Okay. The death of Jesus and the idea of atonement. I think you have a slide you may want to refer to.
Oh, yes. Okay, good. Do I just do the ritual show?
It will come up next.
Okay, so for me, Rich, go away from that. Go take that slide down for a second. Here's the thing for me. It was my scientific brain. So the whole idea, he dies and he's comes back to life. Why? The Bible claims, the New Testament, that he lived and died to reconcile us with God. So immediately in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, well, this really boils down to a simple algebraic equation. which is God is perfection, right? We're imperfection. So how in the world do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? So this is, okay, now Rich, you can show it. So for me, this is it. You call X is the unknown in this equation, right? You have imperfection, that's us. What can I add to imperfection? What can I add to humanity? What can I add to the world that will reconcile, that will equal perfection? Solve for the equation. It's a trivial. Remember algebra? You have to isolate the unknown on one side of the equation. Well, then you have to subtract the imperfection from both sides. So next slide. So what you get is X equals perfection minus imperfection. Not perfection, but perfection minus imperfection. In other words, whatever this entity is that is designed to reconcile imperfection with perfection has to not only be perfection, but has to have the power to remove imperfection. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, that's exactly what Bible calls Jesus. So for me, that was, again, it was like I didn't have to, it didn't challenge my mind very much. That was pretty easy. Yeah, I mean, that was easy. Yeah.
So the death of Jesus as an atonement for us
yes.
to heal the breach
yes.
between creature and
creator. That's what it's all about. How
That's
do you
what
reconcile perfection with imperfection? That's quite an interesting problem. How do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? And unless you solve that problem, there's going to be animus between perfection and imperfection. And of course, that's the Old Testament. How do you reconcile perfection with imperfection? Bingo, X, Jesus.
There you go.
And then he talks the way he does. Oof, fascinating. Anyway, go ahead.
All right, the resurrection.
The resurrection, again, I mean, if you want to think about it strictly from a scientific point of view. The concept that something would be destroyed and be thoroughly destroyed is not scientific. When we study the universe, everything is about something will be destroyed, but something is always conserved. I can't get into it. It's a fascinating subject, okay? But we have what we call conservation laws, that when you destroy something, let's say I take a sledgehammer to a watch. I have a watch here, I take a sledgehammer. You think, I destroyed that watch, it's done. That's a human being, he's dead. There's nothing left. Boom, it's over. It's like Stephen Hawking, I was the first correspondent to interview Stephen because we had met at Harvard. He was very shy about being interviewed, but I actually flew to England. He trusted me, and I interviewed him and his wife and his young son at the time, Tim. But Stephen would say, may he rest in peace, that, when you die, you die. It's lights out. He had a very typical atheist point of view. It was my point of view for many times. And other people would say the same thing. Dawkins will say things. Death is death. It's over. Curtains come down. There's like nothing. Well, that's not scientific. So if you want to take a scientific point of view, you have to say, no, when you destroy that watch, mass is conserved, electric charge is conserved, energy is conserved, other things are conserved. So in almost every situation where the universe goes through a very dramatic turmoil or a dramatic change, when something is destroyed, invariably things about that thing are conserved. They live on. So the whole concept of, hey, there's an afterlife, there's life after death, that was not a problem for me to understand because it was very scientifically based. It's a concept that is typical of what we know about the universe. What's not typical is something that you would claim is dead and gone forever. Everything about it is gone. No, that's violating all the laws of the universe that we know about.
Okay. The last one, and that is the idea of faith.
The what?
Faith.
Faith.
The buoyancy story.
Oh, yes. Okay, so here's what I always hear, and it drives me crazy. But people will say, well, the faith and science and faith. No, it's not that. You have to understand that no matter what worldview you have, and there are many worldviews represented here tonight, and I respect each and every one of them, but every one of your worldviews is ultimately founded on concepts, axioms, axiomatic beliefs that you cannot prove. You have to take on faith. So when somebody says, are you a person of faith? Everybody's a person of faith. The only question is, what do you have faith in? What is the foundation of your worldview? So when I was a scientific monk, when I had an atheist worldview, one of my axioms was seeing is believing. That was one of my axioms. I couldn't prove to you that was a great foundation stone for my worldview. There's no proof for it. I can't prove to you that the best way to live is by the motto, seeing is believing, but I believed it. It was a foundation stone of my worldview until it was knocked out from under my worldview because of what I started discovering in science. So when I hear people speaking about faith versus science, no, it's not faith versus science. Science is a faith-based enterprise. It just has faith in different things. Euclidean geometry is faith-based. Euclid had 33 axioms, one of which was mind-blowing. He said, let us define a mathematical point as something that has no dimension. No height, no width, no breadth. Well, how can it be something if it has no dimension? But you have to accept that premise on faith in order to see what Euclid came up with. So I came up with believing is seeing. I had it backwards. I put seeing ahead of believing. It's really believing is ahead of seeing. And Euclid's geometry is a perfect example of that. If you refuse to believe in his 33 axioms, you will never see for yourself what results from those 33 axioms. So the proper way to think about it is to simply say, yes, you can ask the legitimate question, is there a conflict between this Christian worldview and science? Is there a conflict between the Buddhist worldview and science? Is there a conflict between the atheist religion and science? Because atheism too is a religion. It's a worldview. It's based on faith in certain axioms. You empower randomness. You empower the quantum vacuum. So whatever worldview you have, it is faith-based. So it's not faith versus the world. It's just different worldviews see the world differently.
Right, and true faith versus intellectual assent, the buoyancy story. Remember when you...
Oh, yes. Okay, so you have a worldview. Like, I had a scientific worldview. And I remember from a very young age being fascinated with Archimedes and the law of buoyancy. And there's a whole story about him in the bathtub, and I won't get into that. But it fascinated me. So you can say that I had faith in the law of Archimedes, the buoyancy law. Well, I'm in high school, and the high school I was attending in Southern California required you to pass a swimming test before you could graduate. Well, it happens that I'm afraid of water. And I acquired that, I believe, early on because my mom was afraid of water. And one day when I was very young, my uncle Marty, Theo Marte, and my father, couldn't have been more than 2, 3. We were out in the ocean and they started playing football with me. In other words, they started tossing me back and forth because both of them were expert swimmers. And they didn't mean anything bad about it. They were just having fun. Hey, here he goes. And I was petrified and I carried that. So I was in a dilemma, James. Here I couldn't graduate from high school unless I passed a swim test. So I remember being in the pool and the coach, I said, Coach, I can do okay in the shallow as long as I have my feet on the ground. And I remember he had this long pole with a padded end. And he said, no, just grab hold, just trust me. He said, grab hold of the padded end. I'll drag you over to the deep end. Just tread water like we showed you. And I'm like, I'm telling you this story because think about it. I knew the law of Archimedes. I knew that my specific gravity was smaller than the specific gravity of water. So I would be naturally buoyant. I believed that with all my mind, but I didn't trust it. And so when I decided to explore Christianity and I started taking the Christian worldview, I was intrigued by it. I reached a point where I believed the Christian worldview, but I hadn't gone that step further and trusted it. And that didn't happen until right around the early 2000s. And I had an experience that I don't want to get into it here. I describe it in the book, but it was profound. And I identify that's the moment when I went from merely believing, merely having faith in the Christian worldview to truly trusting my entire life on this God that is described in the Bible. That's what we call in Christianity the moment of surrender.
Very good.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome.
A couple of things.
Yes, sir.
Last chapter in the book, you talk about worldview being your religion.
Yes, of course.
And what's at the center of your worldview is your God.
There are three things that are important about your worldview, and each and every one of you should just interrogate yourself. What is your worldview founded on? What are the axiomatic beliefs that you build your worldview on? What's the size of your worldview? That is to say, are you a materialist so that your worldview is very small? You only believe in things that you can see or touch or measure or whatever. That's fine. If that's your worldview, it's very small. It's like a little studio apartment. Or if you allow for the possibility there may be things that are non-physical that exist, and then you kind of go from the studio apartment to the duplex. But anyway, and then the third question is, what is at the center of your worldview? That's the thing that means the most to you. It's the thing that around which everything else in your worldview revolves. It's the one thing you cannot do without. It's the thing that you most treasure. Whatever that is, that's your God. So your worldview is your religion. That's it. And we all have it. And it's all faith-based. It's just a question of what do you have faith in, what's at the center of your, and how big is your worldview? That's the only thing that distinguishes us tonight and distinguishes all 8 million people on planet Earth. That's those three things, those three parameters are the only thing that distinguish 8 billion people on planet Earth.
Once you begin to center your thinking and your worldview on God,
yes,
you were able to move beyond your dream to your destiny.
That was a big deal.
Can you talk about that? And we'll conclude here.
Yes. I was a kid driven by my dream. My dream was to become a scientist. That was my entire life. So I was very much into dreams. It's like Disney. I have a very good friend of mine who is a former senior executive at Disney. It's all about follow your dreams, the dream, little Jiminy Cricket. And that's fine. And you know what? Dream big. I told my boy, who we adopted at age 4, and I tell that whole story in the book because he was a miracle. He's I take a bullet for that kid. And I always said to him, I said, dreams are free, Bubba, so just dream as big as you can. It's like going into the store and you have the little bitty thing that's real cheap and then you got the real big expensive one. Go for the expensive one because it's going to cost you the same thing, which is zero. And so I'm big into dreams, right? But what I discovered as I went through this crazy journey that I've been on, and it's really quite remarkable when I reflect on it, nothing I ever expected, not at all. I just wanted to be a scientist. That's all, James. That's all. It was a simple dream. Then she comes into my life, ruins it all. No. It's like a little nuclear bomb in my... But I honestly don't know where I would be without her. I certainly would not be here tonight with you. I'd probably be holed up in some lab. But what I discovered is something even grander than your dream is your destiny. Now, what's the difference? Very big difference. See, dream comes from you. It originates with you. It's what you hope to do with your life. Your destiny originates with the one who made you. It's a big difference. And so the question becomes, and I talk in college campuses all over the world, been to Reykjavik, Warsaw, Poland, all over the world, and the kids really resonate with it. Like, Dr. G, how do I know my destiny? And I talk about, I've developed a little mnemonic, or a little thing, how I feel that you can find your destiny. Again, we don't have the time. But what I have discovered, James, and sitting here, having the privilege of being here with you tonight, and I mean that quite sincerely, because there's some part of me that is still that little kid from East LA. That little Mexican kid who asked a jillion questions, who had this dream of escaping from the barrio. I wasn't athletic. Although I tell the story, they would fight over me. They would say, you take him. No, you take him. You would take, But I knew athletics wouldn't get me out. But when I look back on my life, I realize that somewhere along the line, I went from pursuing my dream to finding my destiny. And part of my destiny is being here tonight with you and with all these lovely people who have decided to spend part of their evening with me. I feel so overwhelmed and so humbled. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to make an observation.
Yes, sir, please.
I usually do that at the end of these interviews
Okay.
when I get to conduct them.
Yes, sir.
And what I try to, as I study and interpret your life, what I'm kind of looking for is trying to discern is, what is this person's ultimate mission? And you grew up in a religious background, and the expectation was that you would be a pastor.
Yeah.
And the Lord took you on a long detour through the world of science and has brought you back to a place of profound international spiritual influence by way of the world of science. And pastors, their responsibility is to help people who already know God grow. I think your life mission is to help people who do not yet know God know that there's a God and that He's there for them and wants a personal relationship with them. And you can say that in a way that no pastor can say it because of the long and winding road that God took you down to bring you to this place of deep faith and trust in Him. And that's the shape your ministry is taking now. And there is an announcement that you will be making soon.
Yes.
Regarding a development that you're involved in.
Yes.
That's going to be pretty grand scale, and we can't say much more about it.
No.
But it's all coming full circle to this place where you're speaking truth into a subculture that needs somebody to speak to it authentically, and you can do that as no pastor can. And this is God's design for you. And we appreciate you being here tonight and speaking to all of us and putting a perspective in our hearts. As I've studied your life, I had a lot of unanswered questions in the science realm, and this studying your book has helped me do that. Helped me come to a place of clarity that I didn't have before. And I love the perspective of I'm using terms maybe not totally comfortable with, not faith or science, but faith and science. They come together. Yeah. And there's the stereoscopic vision. Yes. And when you see through both lenses, that's your best chance of seeing the totality of reality. God in the center.
Yes.
And that's what I think you're here to do.
Well, James, I hadn't thought of it that way. I'll be honest with you, and I'd like to finish by saying something that I normally say at the beginning of my presentations when I'm on college campuses especially, and that is this, and I mean it quite sincerely, and that is, I don't see myself that way like you just described. I see myself, and this is the best way to describe to you is what I say to the kids. I'm not here tonight to defend a point of view. I'm not here tonight to defend the faith. I'm not even here tonight to defend the truth. Because a very wise man by the name of Charles Spurgeon once said, truth is like a lion. It doesn't need defending. All you need to do is set it free, and it will defend itself. So tonight, I'm not here as an evangelist, as a pastor. I'm here as just one individual who has spent his entire life trying to figure out this mystery called life. And I'm on a journey. And that's why I call my followers my fellow travelers. And I have a podcast every week, and I have people from all over the world, and they're my fellow travelers, and I love every one of them. And I have a lot of atheists who follow me because I have a lot of respect for it. No matter what your worldview, I respect it. Okay? But I'm here tonight simply to say to you, this has been my journey. This is what I've learned on my journey, in the hopes that it'll help you. And if it does, fantastic. And if it doesn't, I apologize. I hope I haven't wasted your time. But at least you got a nice meal out of it, you know? So this is what I'm all about. But I do appreciate you saying what you said, brother. But I want to maintain that. I just want to be somebody, one person out of 8 billion who's just here to share what he's learned on his long and winding journey. That's it.
Okay, we're going to conclude now, and here's how we're going to conclude. Michael, I'm going to ask you to pray.
Oh, okay.
And then we're going to have a brief prayer, and then we're going to have just a moment of silence. And we're going to ask you to direct your attention to the Lord. And whatever you've gleaned from this story, would you express that to the Lord in the privacy of your own heart? And then I'll conclude with prayer. So let's pray together. Michael, if you'll pray first.
Okay, shall we bow our heads then and just simply say, Lord, creator of the universe, the love of the God of love and light and life, the one who never gave up on me. I was so far away and so lost, and yet you went out of your way to reveal yourself in the one thing that I love the most, science. And I thank you for that. I thank you for not giving up on me. I thank you for Laurel, for the change she made in my life. You used her in mighty ways. I thank you for every single person who's in this room tonight. I just feel a great love. You say to us, the two greatest commandments is to love you with everything we have. I try to do that every day. And the second one is like the first, love people. And I love people, people of all kinds. I just love people. But I love truth. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on this journey. I often say that I took the scenic route instead of the shortcut. But in that scenic route, I've met so many wonderful people, and I've learned so many wonderful things. So tonight, I just pray for every single person in this room. You and you alone know what's in their heart. You know more about them than they know about themselves. And I just pray that whatever I might have said tonight in sharing my own journey, that perhaps they have learned something from me that will help them in their journey. And I pray all of this in the name of Jesus, my Lord and Savior. Amen.
Let's give this friend a big round of applause.
Thank you, James.
That was
Thank you. God bless
awesome.
you.
That was perfect. Couldn't have been more perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.